All right. Hey everyone. Hope you guys are doing fine this afternoon. I'm going to be hosting a quick workshop about the helicopters event for Science Olympiad, and this presentation is essentially for both Div B and Div C. Um, if you have taken a look at both rule sets, you'll see that there's not many notable differences between the two. In terms of the size of the helicopter that's allowed, they're both pretty similar, and other rules about motors are also again pretty similar. In fact, talking about the rule sheet, we'll actually be getting into that very shortly. Just a quick rundown for this presentation is that we're going to be going over the rule sheet, some difficult topics about the event itself. Um, Normally we talk about common questions, but since this event is not really about testing, as in, set knowledge event, we're just going to be omitting that part. And I guess tips from a veteran per se. I myself have competed in a science Olympiad for close to 7 years, both in middle school and in high school. And I did helicopters for one of those years when it was an event during COVID. And then I'm also going to be talking about some free resources that I found while I was competing in other flight events, including Right Stuff, which is one of the replacement events for helicopters. So starting with the rule sheets, this is probably the most important thing that you're going to want to look at when you are starting this event if you have not started already. And essentially, what it's going to do is help you identify what you can build for the event. Now, helicopters itself, you're building a helicopter. Um, but with that, the Science Olympiad organization has given you rules about what you can build for the event itself. Specifically, as I've noted here, some of the important um, rules that they have set out for the event. So, firstly, when you do build a device, no matter what design of helicopter you're going to be building, you need to be able to fit it in a 32 centimeter by 24 centimeter by 47 centimeter box. I believe they state in the rule sheet that it's typically like box of the size can hold about 8 reams of paper or something like that. That's a good benchmark, but just know that your box should be these exact dimensions. And ideally, you would build a box if you can't find one, at a store or something like that. You would build a box this size at your school or at home, just so that you can make sure whatever helicopter you build will fit inside that box. Because if you don't have a helicopter that fits these build parameters, you will get tiered and essentially, when you get tiered, you're not going to be competing for a medal at that point. You'll be competing in the tiered division, which is a bunch of other teams that have not been able to fit those build parameters. Additionally, the rules state that you can have up to 3 fixed pitch rotors. Obviously, what that means is that if you've ever looked at a helicopter, you know that it has a massive set of blades that's rotating. That means for your helicopter design, you can have 3 sets of those rotors. Obviously, you don't have to use 3 sets. If you wanted to use one somehow, you could, though I will say most designs use two due to the benefits of just having an even number of rotors typically. So uh, using two is most likely ideal. But again, if you find during your testing that maybe you want to use three, or somehow you find a design that can work with one, you are allowed to do that. You are only allowed to go up to three, though. Finally, the mass of the helicopter that you do build has to be 4 grams or more. And that's excluding the rubber motor that powers the helicopter. This rule essentially is just so that kids don't show up with like a piece of plastic and throw it up in the air and say, "There's my helicopter," and it floats down slowly. This is just to make sure that the device you're building is actually itself a helicopter. So once you do build it, weigh it, see if it's 4 grams. Ideally, you want to be as close to the 4 gram mark as possible because obviously it's much easier to keep something airborne if it's lighter rather than it being heavier. And if you get something that's like maybe 3.5 grams or 3.8 grams, that's great. All you'll do is just add some glue or glue on some wood or maybe put clay even on your helicopter to just make it slightly heavier to reach that minimum threshold. Because remember, it's always easier to add weight to your device than it is to remove weight. And ideally, we want our weight to be as close to the minimum as possible. And finally, the I think the last and most important rules for, or I guess technically in this case, lack of rule for this event is that your rubber motor can be of any mass or any length. To get your helicopter airborne, you need some sort of power source. And that is your rubber motor, which you wind up, which stores energy that is then released by your helicopter as the blades spin. And by allowing you to have a rubber motor of any mass or length, you're able to experiment with many different types of rubber thicknesses and rubber band lengths that you use on your device to, help get your helicopter airborne for the longest period of time. And honestly, that was all I found that was really notable about the build parameters based on the rule sheet. Then the next thing that I would say is pretty important is a flight log. A flight log is essentially, as it says in the name, just a recording of some data from the flights that you have while you were testing your helicopter or your device. In the rule sheet, they identified three parameters that you have to record, those being motor size, number of turns or torque of the motor before launch, and then finally flight time. However, the rules state that you need 6 total parameters, which means not only do you need those three that I just mentioned, but you need to essentially make up three other parameters that you think would be useful in helping you record or improve the flight times of your helicopter/device. Some examples that they provided in the rule set were number of winds remaining on motor, propeller pitch, and estimated peak flight altitude. While these parameters may not seem to be the most useful, I can see some uses for some of these parameters, such as number of winds remaining on motor can help you determine whether you need to change the thickness of your rubber band. Because if your helicopter stops flying with a bunch of winds still left, it means that it wasn't able to get all of its energy out by having the blades of the helicopter turn, indicating that the rubber band was not strong enough. Propeller pitch, obviously, that's just another parameter that you can just measure. Sometimes by making the propeller pitch very steep, you can have your helicopter shoot straight up into the air instantly, which may not be something that you want because it could damage the helicopter. So take that whatever way you will. And then estimated peak flight altitude. Honestly, if you have a very tall ceiling, which I don't know what the exact testing room will look like when you guys do go to competition. But if you have a very tall ceiling, it might be useful to just have your helicopter hover around like halfway between the ground and the ceiling. But honestly, it's usually just best to have the helicopter go straight up and sit on the ceiling itself because then you're able to put in a lot of energy into that rubber band. So again, these parameters don't have to mean anything to you, but sometimes if you are able to record things that do have meaning, I highly recommend recording those parameters in your flight log as well. And then finally, all this is stuff that you would do before competition. And then there's the competition itself. During competition, you're going to be given a 10-minute flight period. So this is after you check in your device, they check everything about your build parameters, again, making sure it fits within the box, making sure you only have up to three fixed pitched rotors, your thing weighs more than 4 grams, and then check your flight log to make sure you have enough flights recorded and then enough parameters for those flights recorded. After that, you'll be given 10 minutes to essentially set up your helicopter for 2 official flights. Official flights are flights that are actually recorded, and those times are going to be used to help score you against other teams. Now, in those 10 minutes, you are essentially allowed to do as many unofficial flights as you want. However, be wary that you don't want to be doing a bunch right before you start. Because say your helicopter flies for about 3 minutes and it takes 2 minutes to set up your helicopter, right? If you take 2 minutes to set up your helicopter, 3 minutes to do an unofficial flight where you're just making sure it's fine, once it comes down, it's going to take you an additional 2 minutes to set up for the next flight, and then 3 minutes to do your actual first official flight. But at that point, your 10-minute period is up. So you only get one flight in, and you're relying on one official flight for your competition time. Obviously, I think a lot of competition venues typically allow for concurrent unofficial like testing where you haven't checked in the same competition venue. So ideally, if that is allowed, make use of it. If not, hopefully you can go into competition with enough testing at home done beforehand to help you be confident in the way that your helicopter will fly given the way you set it up so that you don't even need these unofficial flights. Are there any questions about the rules or anything like that before I move on? I'll take that as a no. So now some difficult topics with the event itself. So I think the most difficult thing is probably just sorry. Um, someone raised their hand. Vunch. I'm sorry. If you want to just unmute and
You guys can use the chat if you have any questions.
oh, I don't know if they're allowed to mute.
Yeah, unmuting is disabled,
Oh, my fault.
unfortunately.
Okay, no worries. Yeah, I guess just asking the chat. I see one question in the chat that says, if you start the flight within the 10-minute periods, are you allowed to complete it? Yes. So say you're at, maybe your flights are 2.5 minutes and it takes 2 minutes to set up. You know, you spend 4.5 minutes on your first unofficial flight, then another 4.5 minutes on your next unofficial or your first official flight. If you somehow manage to set up your next flight in less than a minute and get it airborne at say 9 minutes and 58 seconds, once that plane leaves your hands, or sorry, not plane, helicopter leaves your hands at 9 minutes and 58 seconds and is airborne and the proctors are timing it, that time will still count as your second official time. So you should be good there. Um, I'm gonna let him type up his question in the chat. Hopefully, I'm gonna continue explaining this next slide really quick so we just keep things moving. But yeah, so the first step in this event is essentially designing your first helicopter and just getting it airborne. Obviously, when you're designing a helicopter, you have to take into account the build parameters that are outlined by the rule set. So as we stated, it needs to be at least 4 grams, maximum of 3 fixed pitch rotating surfaces, um, or 3 sets of fixed pitch rotating surfaces, and then it has to fit within the box of the dimensions that I mentioned earlier. So because the box is kind of a long shape where, sorry if I go back, yeah, where it's 32 by 24 centimeters, which is not exactly a square, but let's assume it's squarish in the sense. Um, these two dimensions are kind of close relative to each other compared to 47 centimeters, which means you're kind of establishing like a long rectangular prism. For that, most people right now are currently recommending the tornado design, which is what's shown here on the right. These are both designs that are produced by current kits that are available for sale and purchase if you are willing to do that. But I just wanted to include them here as examples because they show how you can fit a helicopter in a sort of longish rectangular prism with the long edge being this way, obviously. And for this design, it'd be up and down. So this is the design that seems to be predominant right now. But obviously, if you want to choose another design, you are allowed to. You just have to make sure that you're making the design most efficient based on the build parameters that are identified in the rule set. Again, given that it is a longish rectangular prism in the vertical sense, most likely, you are allowed to. This design is most likely going to be one of the more efficient designs out there, but there's no rule stating that it has to be a tall rectangular prism. If you want to somehow build a helicopter that is more wide than it is tall, you're also welcome to do that. And once you do decide on a design, you have to obviously build the helicopter itself so that you can compete with it. So, what materials typically are good for a helicopter? Well, if we look at both of these designs, you'll see that they are not, they do not have any excess materials pasted onto them if it is not needed. Like here, you can see that they have the main shaft of the helicopter, and it's as thin and narrow as possible, just so it can hold the rubber band and keep the two blades separate from each other. For this, for any helicopter or airborne device that you're building, you want to use the lightest and least dense balsa wood you can possible that is capable of supporting whatever load is going to be placed on it. So you don't need to go out to maybe your hobby store or to any wood store and buy, plywood or basswood even. Most helicopters and uh, flight devices are typically built using balsa wood because it tends to be super light and very uh, not dense for what it is, while still being structurally strong enough for the flight device itself. Then, when we have to cover the flight surfaces, which are actually in contact with the air and are responsible for the thrust that's responsible for making the device airborne, it is recommended to use the thinnest plastic bags you can find. So obviously, if you want to use maybe the plastic from a trash bag, you could, but that's pretty thick plastic, so it's not recommended. Maybe some plastic bags from a grocery store or even Mylar plastic that you can buy online that's super thin, that's more recommended. Because what it means is if you have thinner surfaces, excuse me, if you have thinner surfaces, it's less weight added to your overall design, allowing it to be lighter and ideally closer to that 4 gram weight that is identified as the minimum for your helicopter. You can even see on this, actually, I think on both of these designs, you can see that they don't even use balsa wood on the leading and trailing edges of the helicopter blade. In this design, they're actually using carbon fiber because it's super strong and super lightweight. So if your helicopter says hits anything on the ceiling, maybe balsa wood will break, but carbon fiber is a bit more resilient. So again, if you're able to find some super lightweight, super strong material and you can build with it and you're justified with it, please do use it. But your main goal is to save weight. Finally, the other part of this helicopter is the rubber motor. That is the one thing that is powering your whole helicopter. So as I mentioned earlier, you have no specified mass or length of rubber band that has to be used for your helicopter based on the rule set. That gives you guys a lot of freedom and leeway to essentially go out, find whatever rubber supplier you want, and buy the rubber thickness you want and cut it to whatever length you want. So I have some links to suppliers later in the video, or sorry, later in the presentation, which I can show you guys. But essentially, you just want to be testing all the different combinations that you can, just so that you guys can understand if I use a rubber band of this certain thickness at this certain length, this is the maximum time I can get my helicopter to fly based on those parameters. And then you will have a baseline that you can compare off of saying, okay, if I make my rubber band thicker, will that change my time by increasing it or lowering it? And so on and so forth. I'll get more into that, I believe, on the next slide when I talk about testing and optimization. Are there any questions about this slide? Yes, I should go back to the chat. Um, oh, yeah. Essentially, ideally, balsa wood is probably best for when you're building the actual, I guess, main shaft of the helicopter, but carbon fiber I think is really good if you're building on something that may come into constant like contact by hitting something that's on the ceiling, which is why it's I believe used on the leading edge of the helicopter blades for that design I was showing. But yeah, all right. So now testing itself. So testing a helicopter is actually, I think, very easy for what it is compared to other flight events. Personally, I competed in Right Stuff, which, if you guys are not familiar with, is a event where you build essentially a rubber band powered airplane. The issue with that airplane is that you typically need a large room, large open room, to have your airplane fly around and around for like however many minutes you can get it to. That seems pretty simple, but typically it would take up a whole gym just to get that super wide circle. Helicopters, they just tend to go straight up and straight down. So honestly, if you are at home and you have a flat ceiling, like I have a flat ceiling right here, you can test your helicopter at home if you really wanted to, as much as you can. Um, or maybe if you guys are traveling to a competition and you're in your hotel room, and you can turn off the AC so that you don't have to deal with random air currents pushing your helicopter around from the air conditioning system. You can test it in your hotel room. Again, be careful, obviously, but you want a room that is open with minimal obstructions on the ceiling and a flat ceiling if possible. Height of the room does not matter as much for this event because if we go back on the previous slide, you'll notice that the rule set also identifies that you should have a sort of, I'm not really sure how to word this, but let's call it a bumper on the top of your helicopter, which essentially means if you put too much power into your helicopter itself and it starts to, just kind of hover by pushing up against the ceiling, it's not like, you know, pushing like a hard point into the ceiling itself. So it has like a kind of cushion or bumper, as I said earlier. With that, if you put a lot of power into your rubber band, you can essentially send your helicopter to sit up on the ceiling. So once it gets up there, it's essentially just going to stay up there with its, blades rotating around and having the helicopter just hover right there with this bumper sort of serving as your point that keeps it there up against the ceiling for a little bit until eventually your rubber band runs out of power and it hovers back down. So when you do start testing your first helicopters, don't expect it to be like a sort of beautiful, slow ascension up to the ceiling and then sitting there for maybe a minute or two and then slowly descending back down. A lot of times when you build your very first helicopter, your rotor blades may be unstable. They may not even be glued on straight. And if that is the case, what you'll see is that your helicopter will vibrate because the rotors are not balanced and you have uneven masses rotating on your helicopter. And if the rotors aren't glued on straight, you'll have what's called directional thrust. So if one of your blades, like if these are my two sets of blades, if one is pointed this way, that thrust is not going straight down. It's going that way. So it'll try to rotate your helicopter around. Obviously, if that's the case, all you need to do is just quickly re-glue your blades or balance the blades using glue, wood, or whatever you can to add mass on the side that's not got enough weight on it. Or in the case of the uneven blades, you might want to just quickly detach the blades and then re-glue them on so that they're as straight as possible. But with the first test, you're just trying to see if your helicopter can get airborne. If it flies a little erratic, that's okay. You can fix that after your first couple of tests. And with the tests that you are collecting, you need to collect data, obviously, not to just help yourself, but for the rule set, or based on the rule sets for your flight log. So as I identified earlier, weight of the motor is required. How many winds you put into the motor slash torque, that's required, and flight time is required. I think length of the motor might also be helpful, um, as it can help, or and thickness, sorry, of the motor itself, because that can help you determine the specific parameters of the rubber band that you're using, whether it's impacting your flight time or how long, or my apologies, how quickly your helicopter is ascending and descending. Again, I'll get a bit more to the rubber band in the next slide, so that you can understand why that's very important. And then, as I was describing earlier, any interesting characteristics of the flight. Did the helicopter drift in one direction? Did the helicopter vibrate? Vibrations usually indicating uneven rubber bands or uneven rotors, sorry, and anything else like that. That might be an issue with the construction of the helicopter itself that you can fix by, altering some things after your first couple of flights. Any questions based on this slide? So for the question that's asking if the helicopter wobbles too much, is it the center of gravity? Center of gravity is typically used to kind of describe more the overall device itself, but I think I know what you're talking about. It's probably more in terms of the blades. And yeah, it has to do with how much weight is on each side of the blade. So if I go back here, say this helicopter had a heavier blade on this side and a lighter blade on this side. If this is rotating around, obviously that's going to unsettle the helicopter because when something's rotating, the heavier side will typically overrule, I guess, the lighter side in terms of its, I don't know the exact physics vocabulary. It might be inertia, it might be momentum, but it's going to overrule that lighter side, which causes that vibration that you're seeing. So obviously, all you need to do is just figure out which side is the lighter side and ideally add weight, or actually, ideally, you would be able to remove weight so that your helicopter is lighter, but most likely you're going to have to add weight to the lighter side so that both blades are even, and that will help you get a more stable flight. Let me know if that answered your question, but I'm going to keep going on with the presentation. Okay. Finally, optimization. So once you've built your helicopter and actually gotten it airborne and proven that it can get airborne, you want to get your helicopter to fly for the longest time possible. So how do you improve your flight times? Essentially, it's a bunch of testing and a bunch of slight alterations of your testing parameters for your helicopter. Now, typically, you don't change much in terms of the actual build of the helicopter itself. Like, you won't be if I go back, you won't be just suddenly swapping from this design to this design between, your first test, your second test, and your third test. Usually you build one design, you try to optimize it as much as you possibly can. And if you see that there's, something that is truly wrong with the design that altering the parameters does not help, then you swap designs. So what can you optimize or alter in terms of the parameters of a helicopter? Well, when I was doing right stuff, there was a lot of things you can alter. You could alter the motor itself, you can alter the propellers that were used, you could alter the pitch of the wings, a lot of parameters. But with helicopters, as I'm saying, there's usually one main thing that you can alter, and that is the motor. Because the motor is what's powering your helicopter to go up and down, or sorry, keep it from coming down. So the rubber band is probably the most important thing that you can optimize for your helicopter. Now, as I was mentioning earlier, there's no limit or rules that are defining what rubber thickness you have to use or how long your rubber band has to be. So, what do I mean by that? Well, when you make the motor for your rubber band, typically what you're doing is buying a long strand of rubber and then you're going to cut it at a certain length, loop it back on itself, and tie a knot so that it forms a loop, like a rubber band, as you would expect. Now, depending on the rubber you buy and depending on the thickness of that rubber, you can notice some interesting characteristics about the flight you will have. So normally thicker rubber bands, if you've ever, played with the rubber bands on a newspaper, you'll know thicker bands are harder to pull or stretch and so on. That principle applies to this rubber as well. Thicker bands, when you wind them up, they are more likely to release that energy much faster because they want to go back into their state where they don't have any winds. So, say you have a super heavy helicopter that a thinner rubber band cannot get off the ground, going to a thicker rubber band will help you get more energy out of that rubber band faster, which can get it airborne. But if it gets that energy out faster, that's not good for a long flight time. So, say you have a super light helicopter, using a thicker band may not make a lot of sense because if you have a thinner rubber band, sure, it doesn't release all that energy that quickly, but it'll release it over a longer period of time that allows you to have a longer flight time itself. And that goes back to the importance of having a super light helicopter if possible. What about the length of the motor? So, obviously, when we wind up our rubber band, when we wind it up, the whole point is for that rubber band to store energy. If we have a longer band, you can think of it as having a bigger battery of energy for your helicopter. Because if you have a short rubber band, you can only put so many winds, sorry, on that little bit of rubber. But say you double the length of that band, you can essentially store almost double the number of winds, and in our case, let's just say double the amount of energy overall. So that means you'll have more energy for your helicopter to fly, which can result in a longer flight time. But what you don't want is like a rubber band that is, say, the length of my whole room, because that rubber band is going to be super heavy. And at that point, that rubber band is going to be doing more harm by adding so much weight to our helicopter that the additional energy it holds is of no use to us. So that's just something you have to test to see, hey, if I use a rubber band this length, can I go a little bit longer to store more energy and get a longer flight time? Or have I optimized that completely to the perfect length where I should not add any extra length? Um, any questions about that? Yeah, for the question in the chat, if you have too many wines left on your rubber band at the end, it means that the rubber was too thin, like it was too weak to get all that energy out, which means ideally you would want to go to possibly a thicker rubber band of the same length. Um, and also try to alter, I don't think I stated this earlier, try to alter one parameter at a time. So if you're, trying to compare a 10-inch super thick rubber band to a 20-inch super thin rubber band, that's not ideal. What you want to compare is a 10-inch super thick rubber band versus a 10-inch super thin rubber band so that you can see how changing one parameter at a time impacts your flight time. But yeah, too many lines remaining on your rubber band at the end means that you would likely want to go to a thicker rubber band of the same length to just see if that's able to help solve your issue. I'm going to keep moving on just for the sake of time. And then, sorry, if you guys are not familiar with torque of your rubber band, I've put a what's called the dirt cheap torque meter. Its image is shown here, and I've also included a link at the end of the presentation. I'll show you guys it. Um, but all it does is it measures how much twisting force your rubber band has. I, the actual numbers itself are they don't have any specific numerical value. They're just relative to each other. Like you can see, this is a clock face. It does not mean 1 Newton of torque, 2 Newtons of torque. It does not mean that. It's just relative for you to understand how much torque per se is in your rubber band as you wind it up. Uh, and again, torque is just the twisting force of your rubber band. You don't want to put too much torque into your rubber band where it's like, I guess the only way to see how much is too much torque is by testing. But you'll see that if you just continuously wind, and wind, and you get this, dial to turn all the way around up to like maybe 10, you put that in your helicopter, you're going to see that thing rocket off, probably hit the ceiling, and possibly break. You do not want that. What you would probably want is maybe, again, I'm not 100% sure, so I'm just shooting or throwing numbers out there, but maybe some torque between 4 and 6, where your helicopter will go up to the ceiling and hover up there for a little bit as it releases its torque slash stored energy by rotating those blades. And then eventually, once the torque in the rubber band becomes too low, then obviously it can't rotate the blades fast enough, so it falls back down slowly. Again, you can also measure the torque after your helicopter's done its flight and come back to the ground. You can put the rubber band back onto the torque meter and try to not let out any winds, and then you can just measure to see how much torque is left. But yeah, obviously thicker rubber bands typically have more torque, thinner rubber bands typically have less torque for the same number of winds. All right, so tips from a veteran. Testing is probably the most important thing. Uh, it is the only thing that can get you true real world data to help you understand the characteristics of your own device that you built, identify any problems in your design, excuse me, and then help you optimize. There's no, you can't just wind up a rubber band and then let it spin out slowly while it's sat there on your desk. That's not really going to provide you any insight about how long your helicopter flies. You actually have to get into the habit of, winding up your rubber band as quickly as possible, putting it on your helicopter, letting it fly, and then timing it to see what is optimizing your flight time, and then also to get you prepared for the competition itself. Because remember, you only have 10 minutes to do two official flights and however many unofficial flights if you need to. As I said earlier, don't be afraid to test at home. Helicopters is something where it's like, as long as you have a flat ceiling and you can turn off the AC to avoid any odd air currents, you can test it at home and be perfectly safe. Finally, things break. I put just fix them. It's a build event, guys. You're trying to build something that's made out of super thin balsa wood using super thin plastic. If it hits something, it hits something. Just try to repair it to the best of your ability. Ideally, nothing would break, but again, it's the real world. If something hits something else, there's a chance. When you do try to repair it to as close to the same state of the design as before the accident. That will help you maintain consistency between the results you collected before the accident and any results and testing you do after the accident. I put in a note here that says look for any changes in flight characteristics done before and after the repair. And this kind of goes back to, let's say, the example of the wobbling helicopter. Say your helicopter blade hit the ceiling, the maybe one of the blades broke and you had to glue it back together. Well, that glue has weight. So if you glue on one side of the helicopter blade and all of a sudden your helicopter is wobbling as it flies, that tells you your blades are now unbalanced again because you had to put glue on one side. Obviously, the way to repair it, as we are alleviate that issue, as we discussed earlier, is to just put glue on the other side of that blade to counteract the added weight. So again, just look for any changes before and after the repair you made. It'll help you understand what may have changed. Finally, as I was saying, play with the rubber motor sizes. For helicopters, I think it's really the only thing you can optimize for your design. You might be able to obviously change other things like the number of blades you have, or maybe the weight of the helicopter. Don't know why you would. You want it to be close to 4 grams so that you don't need as much energy to get your helicopter up. But use the lack of rules on the rubber motor size to your advantage. And obviously, again, to optimize it, you have to test. Finally, this is a sort of trick that I don't see a lot of teams using, at least not when I was competing, and it's to use lubricant on the rubber band. When you wind up your rubber band, you're gonna get a lot of tension between the two sides of the rubber band. Kind of hard to explain it, but when it gets wound up, the rubber band kind of gets stuck with itself. So if you use lubricant, it'll help get more of that energy out of the rubber band in a smoother manner that allows you to keep your helicopter in the air in a much more predictable manner and get more energy out of your rubber band. And that's just a tip that I have. One of the lubricants I used, there's a lot available that you can buy professionally from like these rubber suppliers, but I didn't feel like paying $30 for something that's like that big. So I would go to Walmart or, whatever store you want to go to and buy Armor All, which is just like a seat cleaner. It's kind of oily, but it acts as a good lubricant if you just spray it on the rubber real quick before and then kind of just rub it into the rubber band right before you fly it. And it helps you just essentially get as much energy out of your rubber band once you wind it up and let it fly out on your helicopter. Any questions about that? I'm gonna keep going. Okay, so these are some of the additional resources I wanted to include. Maybe I can drop these in the link or the links to these in the chat. Actually, I probably will, unless there's an objection to that. But the
Yeah, you can
first one
drop.
is the freedom. Or
You can drop
yeah,
them
go
in the
ahead.
chat. The slides will also be shared to them afterwards, and yeah, so you can drop
Oh,
them in the
okay.
chat, but we'll also share the slides.
Okay. So the first is the Freedom Flight Model Kit website. They sell kits that help you build your first helicopter. And again, if you do want to buy a kit, these are pretty expensive. Not gonna lie, if you don't want to, I completely understand why. But it comes with everything you need to build two helicopters, and it comes with rubber bands included just to get you started on testing. So it's not a bad step, and it also comes with full instructions and blueprints on how to build that rubber band. I mean, sorry, how to build that helicopter. So if you wanted to, you can go ahead, buy a kit, and just get started. And these kits are designed to fit the rule set for the competition year. Like as you see, Helicopter 2025 meets specs for both Division B and C competitors. And additionally, on this website, you can actually see they have rubber available for you to buy. So if you wanted to, you can buy rubber that is 0.065 inches thick, uh, and about 13 grams of it for this price. You can also buy thicker rubber that's 0.094 inches thick, again, and then even thicker rubber at 0.125 inches thick so that you can play with the thickness and length of your rubber band uh, while you are testing. Another kit that's offered is the J&H Aerospace one. This they've literally called it Tornado. And again, it fits the 2025 helicopter rules for Division B and C. Again, the kit is expensive, $60, but it's cheaper than the other kit that I was showing you. And it also is capable of building two helicopters, I believe. And I would say really check out this website because it has a lot of really cool links to it, with like a manual on how to build it. So if you didn't want to buy the kit itself, but you wanted to just buy the individual materials, you can go through and see how to make the helicopter just using the materials you buy from other suppliers. Again, if you do buy the kit, it all comes to you, so it'll help you save headaches with like shipping times and whatnot, and making sure that you get the right materials. But it provides, a bunch of written out instructions and images to help you understand what to do with each step of the way as you're making your helicopter. Plus, I think he has a video of him, yeah, video of him explaining helicopters as well. So if you wanted to, yeah, you can like check out his videos of the helicopter kit itself and so on. Plus, there's a bunch of, things that he recommends you buy, like rubber lubricant. Oh, okay, I guess it's $6. I don't know how big that tube is, but up to you if you want to use this lubricant or not. But yeah, again, completely up to you. I highly just recommend checking out this website because it has a lot of cool tips and a lot of cool links to other materials that you can use for your helicopter. Even if you're buying a kit from, say, this website, you can still use the tips from the J&H Aerospace website to help you optimize your flights for this kit. There's no like, oh, if I have to use the resources from one kit, they don't carry over. Everything carries over. Just make sure that you're optimizing your own helicopter. Um, Finally, if you want true like freedom, like very wild variety of rubber bands that you can buy, this is a really good website, FI Model Supply, where if you look at the Tan Super Sport rubber, you can see how they sell rubber by bulk. Now, it's no new fact that rubber bands will eventually snap after a bunch of winds and a bunch of tests. So obviously, you don't need to buy a 10-pound box. You probably want like either a half a pound or maybe a fourth pound, so something this size. But you can see that they have a bunch of different thicknesses. So they have 1/4, 1/16, 1/8, 3/32. Let's just go to the fourth page. They have mini packs. What else they have? 1/16, 3/16. Like it's a bunch of variety essentially that allows you to buy rubber in bulk and then essentially have as much freedom to continue playing with the helicopter kits and the length of the rubber band itself as you continue testing. Then the dirt cheap torque meter that I had shown on a previous slide, that's just here. There's plenty of torque meter building kits that are out there as well. So if you want to look at those and just build it out of your own materials, please be my guest. But if you want something that's kind of like already laser cut and already easy to build, this is a place where you can just buy one of those dirt cheap torque meters. And it's very simple. I've been using this personally a lot since I've been in middle school and high school competing in the events that have had to use this. I vouch for this one's reliability. Like, I think only one has broken on us ever. And you have to understand that's through like 7 years of competition. So they may be cheap, but they are reliable. And then I think there's one more. Yeah, there we go. One more website. So as I said earlier, helicopters is really a lot about the rubber band. So I wanted to include this website because it kind of goes through the process of actually making a rubber band or a rubber motor itself. So it talks about measuring your rubber to a certain length, then cutting that rubber, drying it out, making sure it's clean, putting on O-rings. I guess I didn't mention this earlier, but an O-ring makes it much easier to get your rubber band onto your helicopter after you've wound it up. So it's really for ease of transfer, which is very useful when you remember the fact that you only have 10 minutes to wind up your helicopter's motor before you have to, you know, be done with your competition time. And obviously you don't want it to slip because if it does, then you're gonna have to rewind your rubber band before you put it on the helicopter again within that 10 minutes. So the O-ring makes it much easier for you to do that. And I highly recommend it. The one thing I will say, uh, take note on this if you want, he only puts one O-ring on it. I recommend putting on two, one for each end of the rubber band that has to go in the helicopter, because it makes it easy to attach it to both ends in that case. So yeah, just do that, do with that what you will. And then obviously he says, put it in some diluted lubricant. Again, same thing that I was talking about. And yeah, so this is useful in, I guess, tying up your first rubber bands and then building your first couple of motors if you haven't built them before. And yeah, that's essentially all I had in terms of links and resources. Since the slideshow will be put out, I'm not going to put them in the chat. You guys can click on those links and look through them yourselves as well. But are there any questions that you guys have for me? Oh, what are my what are the pros and cons of each of the two kits I shared? Honestly, I feel like the Freedom Flight kit, so the first link I showed, typically tends to be a much more durable design, usually, in the sense that it does have carbon fiber on the leading and trailing edges of the blades. So I've been able to do some funky stuff with the planes and helicopters I built from those kits and not had to worry about it breaking. But I don't want to say you can go wrong with either. Like, it really depends. If you go through and look at the design, you just kind of want to take a look and see what suits you best and which one you think might serve you better. Um, I can't really vouch on either of kits, especially since I haven't built a helicopter this competition year. But that's just what I've noticed with J&H Aerospace versus Freedom Flight. And, I wouldn't say one is personally better than the other. Personally, my team back in high school, we were sponsored by J&H Aerospace, and we would buy kits from both and usually end up combining those two kits together because some parts from one kit worked well, and then some parts from another kit worked well. So we were like, just put the parts that work really well together, and then you'll get something that overall as a device works very well. Uh, but yeah, sorry, there's no like clear answer to that. And when you ask what is your opinion on braiding, I'm sorry, could I ask what you mean by braiding? Are you talking about the rubber band? I've never really heard about braiding the rubber band. I I don't know what exact benefit it would provide personally. 'Cause braiding the band, I don't know. I've just never seen that personally. So maybe it's something that's a little new-ish. Okay. Yeah. I've never heard of people braiding the rubber bands. I mean, obviously, it is something you can test. You can go through and try testing with an unbraided rubber band and then build or cut and tie off another rubber band that's like essentially the equal thickness, equal length, and equal weight. Braid it and see uh, how that works. See which one works better for you. Let's see. Thing is too much lubricant. Honestly, we would literally let our rubber bands. We would put our rubber bands in a plastic baggie, fill it with lubricant, and just put the rubber band inside and let it soak in it. So when it came out, it was dripping of with Armor All. Uh, we don't think there's a thing as too much lubricant because as you're winding, at least if you were winding the way I would wind very fast. So a lot of that lubricant would just fly off. And by the time that the helicopter came back down or our plane came back down, usually the band would be a little dry. Like it'd be a little damp, but mostly dry. If you want, you can go ahead and you can kind of use your fingers as like a squeegee to just take off as much lubricant as you can that way. Or you can just like lay it down on a paper towel really quickly and flip it on both sides to get off any extra lubricant. But know that as you're winding, the rubber itself is like squeezing onto each other, right? So it's going to be squeezing out a bunch of that excess lubricant anyway. So yeah, I don't think there is such a thing as too much lubricant. But again, during testing, you might notice that there is. So just keep that in mind. Yeah, of course. Any other questions from anyone else? Stop sharing. Yeah, of course. Have a good night. Oh, uh, honestly, I don't really know. It's been a while since I've competed in Science Olympiad, and I think like I'm a junior right now, so it's been 2 years. And even then, COVID was when I really competed in helicopters, so that was sophomore year for me. So it's been about 4 years since I've seen helicopters. Right stuff, I might be able to give you an estimate, but helicopters, I'm not 100% sure. I think my helicopters would typically fly around 2 minutes ish, but remember that that was a different rule set, so that may not translate as well to this year's rule set. But longest flight time, I don't know. I mean, just it seems kind of odd, but I'm just gonna say aim for the highest flight time you can get as possible. Because I know usually we would think that in right stuff, at least like pushing 3 minutes was like crazy. That would get us a medal at nationals. And then I remember this personally. Some school from I think New Mexico or was it Ohio showed up and they got like a 5 minute flight time. And it was like first place was 5 minutes and second place was like 3 minutes. So I don't know how they did 5 minutes, but just try to aim to be the best for your own device. All right. Um, yeah. I mean, I have nothing else for you guys. So if you do have any questions, feel free to continue ask them in the chat. I don't know if oh, I don't know if any of my contact info can be shared. Uh, if not, that's chill. But yeah, anything else I should be doing, Harsha?
Oh wait, sorry, can you repeat that?
Oh, I'm just saying I have nothing else. So
Oh,
for these
yeah,
guys, if they want to leave, they're free to
yeah.
leave.
Yeah, you're free to leave, and then yeah, we'll post the recording afterwards and the slides. Yeah, thank you so much too. Yeah.